embarking on a discussion of Psalm 119. Of course, the first and most obvious observation to make in encountering the Psalm is, goodness, how enormous it is. It is, without any even remote competition, the longest chapter in the entire Bible. Now, of course, as many of you have heard me comment over the years, we don't get so excited about chapters in most of the Bible. You know why? That is, it's not really an ancestral division of the Bible, except in two books where it is: the Psalms and Lamentations, in both of which the division is indeed the original division, the individual Psalms and the individual Lamentations. And at least one aspect, which is particularly glaring in Lamentations chapters 1 through 4, and also in many Psalms, including this one, is the issue of an acrostic, which of course can't possibly be preserved in translation. But of course, as you know, the alphabet, I mean the original alphabet, which is the Aleph Bet, has 22 letters. And in an acrostic, the successive verses begin with the successive letters of the Aleph Bet. There are a couple in particular, there are a couple in the Psalms in which one letter may be missing. There's always an interesting reason to explore for why that is the case. In Lamentations, there's also the issue of the inversion of two letters. We won't get into that, of course. But we do appreciate that the format of an acrostic is indeed a significant one in the Hebrew Bible. And perhaps right off the bat, we should be considering why indeed the acrostic format is something significant. I'll just note as a particular example in our tradition. As you may be aware, Psalm 145, which is an acrostic, takes a very central place in Jewish liturgy. We recite Psalm 145 at least 3 times daily, twice in the morning service, once in the afternoon service. And in exploring the question in our sources as to why Psalm 145 is so central, one of the dimensions, obviously it can't be the only dimension because Psalm 145 isn't the only example of it, is the fact that it's an acrostic. And what significance is there in this acrostic format? On some level, we regard the letters of the Aleph Bet as not merely being technicalities, but rather conduits through which, as it were, God's wisdom flows into the world. So there's a dimension with respect to the acrostic that resonates with human wisdom as ultimately being the vessel that receives from God. And simultaneously, that implies that those passages in the Bible that are ordered as acrostics are on some level supposed to be particularly instructive. And of course, to that extent, we can readily appreciate that Psalm 119 is definitely intended to be instructive. But of course, there's the additional dimension, and this additional dimension sets Psalm 119 apart from every other acrostic in the Bible. It's not just an acrostic, it's an octuple acrostic. The closest competition is Lamentations chapter 3, which is a triple acrostic. But Psalm 119 is an octuple acrostic, which of course is responsible for its 176 verses, 22 times 8. And what's the significance of it being an octuple acrostic? So in this regard, regarding the significance of numbers, we turn to a significant figure in Jewish scholarship from the late medieval, early Renaissance period, Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague. He lived from approximately 1512, the year of birth is not entirely clear, till 1609. And besides being one of the great scholars of Judaica and philosophers of Judaism in the period, he was also actually a mathematician. He had a close friendship with Tycho Brahe, an interesting biography. But perhaps as a result, he, more than anyone else before him, developed the theory of the significance of numbers in the Bible. And while, of course, we're not going to expand on that to excess because we have much more of an agenda ahead of us, I think it behooves us to consider the significance of the number 8 here. In particular, to consider the significance of the number 8 as he presents it in the wake of numbers 6 and 7. The significance of the number 6, the number of cardinal directions. 4 directions in a plane, up and down. So on some level, our mundane world is subsumed within the number 6. There are also 6 days of the work week, besides the Sabbath. And this, of course, inevitably brings us to considering the significance of the number 7. 7 is vesting the sixfold reality of this mundane world with meaning. So first, spatially, there are 6 cardinal directions, but you aren't anchored in space if you don't have, in addition to the 6 cardinal directions, also a point of origin. That's the 7th. And in the realm of time, of course, self-evidently, you have the 6 days of the work week and you have the Sabbath. And those 6 days of the work week are necessarily anchored in their relationship to the Sabbath, which in our tradition is simultaneously the fruit of the week and its seed, which of course is not just a mixed metaphor. It seems like 2 contradictory motifs. The fruit is the culmination, the seed is the point of germination. But of course the Sabbath is both. It's the fruit of the week that precedes it. It's the seed, the germination point for the week that follows. So again, it's the anchoring of the 6 in the 7th. And in that vein, we can describe the significance of the number 7, again, both spatially and temporally, as investing the realm of the mundane with meaning, with significance, in some sense then the spirituality that inheres in the realm of the physical. And that serves inevitably as the prelude to number 8. The number 8 is all about transcendence. It is specifically 7 plus 1, taking us into the realm of the beyond the 7. And while we can seek to illustrate this on manifold planes, perhaps the most obvious being in 2 dimensions of the cycle of the holy days, that you have the 7 days of Sukkot, of tabernacles, surmounted by 7 plus 1, which is the holy convocation that has in the last 2 millennia also become associated with the celebration of the Torah. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. And manifestly, of course, the celebration of the theophany at Sinai, the giving of the Torah, Pentecost, which is not 7 plus 1, but 7 times 7 plus 1, the 50th day. And again, that essentially amounts to the same idea. And you'll note that in both of these illustrations, there is an inextricable link to specifically the Torah. That is, the rejoicing of the Torah is on the 7 plus 1th day of Tabernacles. The celebration, the commemoration of the traditional date of the Theophany at Sinai, the giving of the Torah, is likewise 7 times 7 plus 1. With respect to the Passover, the physical liberation culminating in the spiritual liberation of receiving the Torah, again, the commemoration of ultimate transcendence. And that brings us to the book of Psalms, but not just Psalm 119. Rabbi Judah Lowy, indeed, notes the octuple acrostic of Psalm 119, and he interprets it as an inevitable reflection of the fact that Psalm 119 is all about the Torah. But he also stresses the point with respect to Psalm 19. Now, Psalm 19 is not an acrostic. It certainly isn't 176 verses long. But what is so glaring and significant for us with respect to Psalm 19 is, how does it begin? It begins with the description of seeking God in nature, if you will, spirituality in the realm of the mundane. A song to the choir master, a psalm of David. The heavens recount the glory of God, and the firmament tells the work of his hands. Day to day utters speech, and night to night speaks knowledge. There need be no speech nor words. Their voice is heard without it. Their measuring line goes forth from them all over the earth. But where the world of man ends, their words speak. He has set a tent in them for the orb of the sun. And then reflecting upon the sun, which is, from our terrestrial perspective, the focal point of the natural world and its culmination. As a bridegroom, it steps forth from its chamber. It rejoices as if it had sole power to run its course, and yet one point upon the heavens remains its origin, and its orbit is within their defined bounds, and thus he is not hidden even before his sun. All of this, again, is reflecting upon the natural world. And how many verses have we considered heretofore in Psalm 19? 7. And the 8th verse, the Torah of the Lord is perfect, all-encompassing. In other words, again, that Torah is the 8th that transcends the 7. So the significance then of specifically the octuple acrostic, and altogether the significance of the number 8, which of course becomes so manifestly obvious in Psalm 119, is something that we inextricably link to the association with the Torah and the role of the Torah as signifying transcendence.
Rabbi, just one clarification. You mentioned the 8th verse of Psalm 19. Are you then, this is in keeping with the Jewish tradition that the first verse is actually the header, correct?
Correct. But of course, in the Masoretic text, it has to be, because after all, the division of the text into verses is dictated by the tropes, by the cantillation points. So yes, so that header is indeed verse number 1, unequivocally. So that means that the 8th verse is the Torah of God is perfect.
And is that the case in Psalm 119?
You have a header in Psalm 119?
I don't know. I don't remember.
I don't think for us, there's certainly there isn't any concept of a header that isn't included in the verses of the text. But I would imagine that in any Bible, there isn't any header in Psalm 119 because it's launching right into it. It's not there isn't that any instruction for the choir master or anything of the sort. I guess. I mean, I don't know. I'm just using the Hebrew Bible. You'll have to give me the contrast note. But I assume we also see you have 176 verses in Psalm 119. Then we're on the same page. Okay, 8 times 22. But again, so to that extent, of course, it's important for us to consider then what this signifies with respect to our attitude vis-a-vis Torah. Before we consider the various, I'll describe them as pseudo-synonyms for Torah. I'll justify my fabricating that word in a moment. But before we do that, just to appreciate the undergirding altogether in speaking about Torah. And in this regard, it behooves me to stress the point that while on the one hand, we of course readily appreciate that the Torah serves as if you will, a user's manual for how to live in this world. And inevitably, in that vein, any user's manual is predicated upon the preexistence of that which you're going to use. Simultaneously, you also relate to Torah on an additional plane as the blueprint of the universe. Now, manifestly, the Torah, as we read it, presumes a universe. It doesn't read as a blueprint. But we have what we might describe as an esoteric tradition, that the Torah, as we read it, is, if you will, the terrestrial counterpart of a transcendent Torah that, as it were, predates creation. Of course, inevitably I had to say predates with quotation marks because God created time and creation, so predates in any literal sense is a meaningless term if time didn't exist. But that Torah on that transcendent plane is, if you will, more primordial, hierarchically superior to the very universe itself. And just what does that invoke conceptually? Obviously, that's a level that definitionally eludes human grasp. But the underlying premise is that the foundation of the physical world is in the spiritual and not the other way around. Of course, the Torah, as we read it, is a user's manual, and as any user's manual, it's predicated upon an undergirding of the universe. But the underlying premise that there is something still more essential than the universe itself, and that everything that exists in the physical universe is not and cannot be self-justifying, because ultimately it exists as the actualization of a spiritual undergirding that is, as it were, planted by God before creation itself. Again, before, in quotes. It's a fundamental premise in the way we relate to the universe itself. That spirituality is not some kind of overlay. It's not something that comes afterward and is superimposed upon an existent universe. It is something inherent in the very fabric of the universe. And indeed, it's even more fundamental than the universe as we observe it. And to that extent, then, when we speak of Torah, we're also invoking that. So, the way I always like to express this as an admittedly simple-minded analogy, just to get the point across, is consider when you go to the dealership and pick up your new car. And of course, together with the car, you get the user's manual. Well, that is one piece of literature associated with the car. There's another piece of literature associated with the car that you don't get: the blueprints of the car. The most obvious difference between the two is, the user's manual should be something that you can comprehend without being an automotive engineer. The blueprint, certainly not. And yet simultaneously, if you think about it, on the most pedestrian plane, if the user's manual tells you that there's a certain button on the dashboard that will accomplish something, it will only accomplish that because in the counterpart of the user's manual, in the blueprint, that button was wired to accomplish what the user's manual says it's going to do. So on some level, the blueprint and the user's manual are reflections of the same underlying essential reality. And so on some level, they are both one and the same. But we can only read Torah on the level of the user's manual. There is indeed an esoteric tradition that the very words of the Torah can be parsed in a different manner than the way we do to read the user's manual, and that would signify transcendent names of God. And indeed, the tradition that the Torah that, as it were, predates creation is a Torah not of black ink on white parchment, but black fire on white fire. And of course, we're not going to belabor this point because it really would take us too far afield. But we appreciate fire eludes our grasp. You cannot grasp fire. The very attempt to do so would, of course, destroy the tools that you have for grasping. Your hands would be incinerated. That Torah of black fire and white fire, of course, likewise, completely eludes our understanding. We cannot grasp it, and if we were to attempt to grasp it, we would incinerate the tool that we have for grasping, not our hands, our minds. So we appreciate that that level of Torah is indeed out of our league. But on some fundamental, essential, even rudimentary level, it's important for us to be cognizant of the fact that the user's manual is a reflection of blueprints, not merely a reflection of a pre-existent car, as it were, but of an underlying divine imperative that the universe itself merely comes to actualize. So that's all, if I may posit it, presumed in the significance of the number 8. And there's one final additional dimension that I feel compelled to note here as a corollary of that verity. And that is an idea that is enunciated in our tradition, the Midrash, on what we read in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 9. The words in the Hebrew, Malkah v'sareh b'goyim ein Torah, bewail the fact that Israel in a state of exile, its king and officers are among nations without Torah. And this verse specifically is taken to highlight a crucial distinction that we need to draw. That is, comments the Midrash, this expression among nations without Torah. If someone says to you, there exists wisdom among the nations, believe it. It does. And the proof text, I can't help but note, but ironically, this proof text in synagogues around the world will be read in the reading from the prophets this coming Shabbat, the prophecy of Obadiah. In the 8th verse of Obadiah, I will cause the wise to be lost from Edom and sagacity from Mount Esau. So if the wise, the Chachamim, are going to be lost from Edom, evidently they were there beforehand. So again, the premise that wisdom exists among the nations, whereas if someone says to you there exists Torah among the nations, don't believe it, citing this verse from Lamentations. Its king and officers are among nations without Torah. Now, of course, predictably, I'm going to state here, obviously, the message of this Midrash pertains precisely to the attempt to conjure up a system of Torah, of spirituality, that is divorced from divine revelation. I keenly appreciate that everyone in this session totally is on the page of recognizing that there is no such thing as a Torah that comes from anywhere other than God. And to that extent, there is no Torah that comes from the nations, that is from humanity qua humanity. There's no humanistic Torah. That is an oxymoron. Torah definitionally is divine. Again, the undergirding of everything that exists in this world. Humanism, to whatever extent it can operate operates as an overlay on a pre-existent world. Our premise is that Torah is the underlay, the undergirding of the world itself. And to that extent, again, we stress that very realization as we embark upon a discussion of the Torah of God. And as we thus embark upon a discussion of the octuple acrostic of Psalm 119. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. I think this is a good juncture to pause. And if anyone has any comments or questions, then please, by all means, feel free.
Would you mind repeating the name of the rabbi in the 1500s who focused on numbers?
Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, often known by the acronym Maharal, which stands for our teacher, the Rabbi Lowy. That was he was known. Anyone have any comments?
Yes. I was interested to hear you talk about black fire and white fire, learning from rabbi that I learned from. He would talk about the words, they leap off the page and they speak to you and your heart more than you reading them on the page. That it was like a switch, we think we read them and then we understand them, but indeed they are leaping off the page and coming into our life. And that somewhat reminded me of this black fire on white fire. I'm interested to hear that. I've never heard that that concept before.
So the idea, again, is something that is enunciated in the Midrash, specifically in speaking of Torah as something that, again, in quotes, antedates creation, that, as it were, God gazed in the Torah and created the world. Now, obviously, that doesn't imply that the Torah is some kind of co-creator with God, because God created the Torah as well. But that, on some level, the Torah is the mediation, as it were, between God and the physical universe as we know it. So again, that the Torah is the undergirding. I think the symbolism of fire, besides what we already noted with respect to that which is impalpable, also helps to convey, and maybe this resonates with what you just said, the idea that we tend to relate to the words as merely means for the ultimate goal, which is our understanding, as opposed to seeing the Word of God as something that is a presence, an actual presence from which, as it were, we imbibe as we would take a sip from an ever-present wellspring that is constantly gushing and providing us with a sustenance. So I think that is relevant here. I realize that talking about wellspring and talking about black fire and white fire is a mixed metaphor, but the idea that there is a presence, an actual presence of Torah with which we connect, as opposed to, well, everything else is just means to our own understanding, and the understanding then is something that exists only in our own minds. No, it's not the understanding exists in our minds. Whatever understanding exists in our minds is through our plugging into this wellspring. So again, the fire we're not going to plug into because we'll get incinerated. But it's important for us to have that conception that there is this counterpart of the user's manual that we read that is indeed transcendent and beyond our grasp. And that again invokes the octuple.
The idea I get from it is that there's this ongoing story. It's alive and it's well, and we get almost like step into the story and become a part of it as it goes along. In that sense, it's quite alive and not something static or, inactive, but quite vibrant in whatever way it is. Well springs, fires, words leaping off the page. It's like happening. So when we open it up, it's almost like an active event that we get to take part in. That's what it seems.
Sure, and again, I reiterate my metaphor of plugging in. In other words, that it is a presence. We're connecting with it. We're not the generators. It's not like Torah is in our minds in some sense autonomously from an external reality. No, the external reality is this presence of Torah, which we are imbibing, to
Yeah, I
which
love
we
it.
get plugged in. Okay,
So good. Thank you.
and of course, this theme is manifestly central in Psalm 119, which is all about connecting with God's word, connecting with Torah.
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay, so now let's launch into the specific agenda of this meeting, which is what I already described a few minutes ago as pseudo-synonyms. I'm not going to describe them as synonyms, and I'm not going to describe them as pseudonyms, but rather as pseudo-synonyms. And there's a reason for my, I suspect, fabricating a word that doesn't exist anywhere else, but nonetheless, synonyms, in the literal sense of the term, exist in English. They do not exist in Hebrew. Why not? Very simply, in English, you could have true synonyms because, excuse me, but English is a mongrel language. There are words in English that derive from its Germanic roots. There are words in English that derive from its French roots. There are words that derive from earlier Latin roots or Celtic roots. And as a result, you can have true synonyms because they came from different sources and they really do mean exactly the same thing. There are times when either because of the original or because of contemporary usage, nuances of connotation have come to distinguish between certain words, but they can still be true synonyms because they come from different places. Whereas we don't encounter that in Hebrew. Hebrew is, in that vein, not only a reflection of Proto-Semitic. In our tradition, Hebrew is the language of creation. It is original. And therefore, we seek in the language of the Bible a nuance of distinction to distinguish between every single word, even in the typical format of the biblical couplet, in which the same idea is being expressed in two parts of the verse. There is, of course, a certain element of repetition. It is a couplet, but it's not exactly a couplet. If it were truly a couplet, then it would be simple verbosity. And the underlying premise that there are nuances of distinction. So when I say nuances of distinction, again, I'm not going to say pseudonyms as if they are completely divorced from one another. But I'm also not going to invoke the word synonym, which would imply that they are identical, but rather pseudo-synonyms that are addressing the same theme, the same idea. But when we explore the precise meaning, we appreciate nuances of difference. I feel compelled in this context to note in particular two monumental authors who are as a lamp for my feet in all of the forthcoming. They were almost exactly contemporaries, and they both invested a great deal of effort into teasing apart these pseudo-synonyms. One being Rabbi Meir Leibush Malbim, who lived in the Ukraine from 1809 to 1879. The other, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, great German rabbi, who lived from 1808 to 1888. The Malbim, it's really the acronym by way he is commonly known, wrote a commentary on almost the entire Bible. And one of the salient features of his commentary is precisely this: to distinguish between words that appear to be synonymous, expressions that seem merely to be restatements, and to appreciate nuances of distinction in order to vindicate his underlying thesis, which is there are no extra words at all in the Bible because everything is coming to add an additional nuance. And Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who bequeathed to us in particular commentaries on the 5 books of Moses and on the Psalms. So there is an extensive commentary on Psalm 119, who likewise emphasizes the nuances of distinction, and in particular in the case of Rabbi Hirsch, to explore through phonetic similarities what the nuances of distinction are among different words that can inform our understanding of where they differ. For the Malbim, it's much more oriented simply with respect to, if you will, the detective work of seeing how these different words are employed in the Bible. So I always note in this regard what a true Bible scholar does with the Hebrew language is akin to any scientific empiricist. That is, you go out in the field and make observations. Well, in this case, you go into the Bible and make observations. You see how words are being used in the Bible. Ultimately, the authors of the Bible are the experts on biblical Hebrew. Their employment of all of the nuances of Hebrew inform our understanding of how the grammar works and how the declinations of verbs work and how the nuances of these pseudo-synonyms are indeed distinct from one another in the uses that we encounter throughout the Bible. And to that extent, without any further ado, let's embark upon the first of the pseudo-synonyms with which we need to contend. And this inevitably rises in the first verse of Psalm 119, the very first phrase, Ashrei Temimei Darech, which I'm going to translate based upon the English translation of Rabbi Hirsch's German translation. Forward stride those who are of moral integrity in their way of life. Now I realize that's adding an awful lot. It's almost a short commentary in the translation itself. But what's critical for our purposes is darech, the construct of the word derech, which means way. And we, of course, will contrast derech with another word that arises shortly thereafter in Psalm 119. We encounter derech on a number of instances in the verses that follow. We encounter derachav, his ways, in verse 3. Likewise, derachai in the first person, my ways in verse 5. And we encounter just a few verses later the term orach, as in verse 15. I will meditate upon your mandates. We're still going to have to discuss what that mandates means, and look upon your, well, the translation may read ways, but it's not the same word. Paths? An interesting question. What distinguishes the derech from the orach? And I must share with you in this regard the salient comment of Rabbi Hirsch, not on Psalm 119. I'd rather share with you in particular his comment on a single verse in which we encounter both of these nouns juxtaposed with one another in Psalm 25, verse 4. Show me your ways, O Lord, teach me your paths. So here indeed, he distinguishes between derech and orach by referring to the former as way and the latter as path. But of course, you will rightly note that way, path, what's the difference in English? I'm not sure there is. But then again, the Bible wasn't written in English. And in the original, when we consider the implications of derech and orach, there certainly is a significant difference. And if I can share with you his comment in this regard, he notes that derech is the movement toward one specific goal, a way. I'm going to add here, even though he doesn't use this German term, a Weltanschauung, an all-encompassing way. He connects the word derech phonetically with dereg madrega, referring to a step or a stair, and therefore posits that the word derech denotes the striving of an individual for the fulfillment of his desires in an all-encompassing vein, as opposed to orach. And here, if anything, we have a far more incontrovertible association. Orach, the same spelling, reads oreach, guest of hospitality, and orecha, a caravan, an arucha, the hospitality that provides the needs of the guest. And to that extent, he posits that orach is used preponderantly to indicate the social path which man walks in his relationships with his fellow men, the path which leads from one man to another.
That's kind of like halacha, right? The way you walk.
That's an interesting problem. Of course, that's a different word, but I'll say halacha can pertain to them both.
The way you walk.
The way you walk
Mhm.
would be the way you walk on the way, and the way you walk on that is the way in terms of your all-encompassing Weltanschauung, and the way you walk on the path that corresponds to your social interactions.
Exactly.
A proper etiquette,
Mhm.
the social mores in which you function. What is particularly salient, I think, in drawing this distinction is that he goes on to note in this regard another verse that features both of these words, I suspect an exquisitely familiar verse to us all, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, that many peoples will go and say, let us ascend to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and in the Hebrew, he will teach us of his ways, and we will go in his paths. And what Rabbi Hirsch proposes in the distinction being drawn here is the ways in the sense of the all-encompassing Weltanschauung, which include, for example, the laws of forbidden foods and forbidden sexual relationships, which were taught in Israel and were intended in their entire scope only for Israel in its capacity as the kingdom of priests, and is only binding on them. That way is something of which the nations will solicit that God instruct them of his ways, but not necessarily the whole shebang. Only a limited part of this code shall one day become the common property of all of mankind. Therefore, Isaiah says, of his ways, instead of he will instruct us his ways, as opposed to we will go in his paths on an all-encompassing plane. The teachings of right and social justice, of righteousness and love, that is, the interpersonal code of upright living, not just morality, upright living. Morality is lower baseline. Upright living is more than just morality. propriety, the fidelity of people to one another, that level, shall one day become part of the life of all mankind without exception. Therefore, Isaiah says, we will go in his paths. So, again, considering the distinction between orach and derech, both pertain to Torah, but can indeed pertain to different aspects of Torah, and this nuance of distinction can be of great significance in our understanding how we relate to Torah, and in much this vein, to what extent we regard the message of Torah as necessarily communicable to others. That is, it's always important for me to stress here, everyone is welcome to come under this great and all-encompassing tent of Torah, but it's not an obligation. That is, certainly everyone is welcome as a votive act to connect with various dimensions of this Weltanschauung of Torah, but certainly with respect to the path, the orach, that dimension of social justice and uprightness and common decency with respect to our fellow man, that's something that isn't merely votive. That's something that ultimately becomes a universal legacy for all of humanity. And it's important for us to appreciate those two dimensions are both present when we speak about Torah. So that's the first distinction that we need to draw. Again, orach versus derech. I think this is also a good juncture at which we can pause because we have a major unit ahead of us. So let's pause, and anyone have any further comment?
My thoughts. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say my thoughts went toward Jeremiah, where we have derechim, walk in the ways. We have that's just one of my favorites, verses. Stand at the crossroads in English and look and ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. I just love that one. But we find the word derechim there as well. So I appreciate this word study. The ways it's translated in English here.
Yeah.
I want to make sure others get a chance, and just as a prelude to that, I think what you're talking about in Isaiah 2 verse 3 about the nations coming to Jerusalem, and it says that he may teach us of his ways, or not necessarily all, but of or from, is just this beautiful idea of God's plan for his Jewish people and for the nations, and that he recognizes that there's some things that the nations can't feel that they can take on, perhaps, that his Jewish people have agreed to take on, but yet you said that there's always this votive element of it, and I just think that is absolutely beautiful, and just seems like so much God to me. It's just an amazing insight that you've just given me from this verse. Absolutely amazing.
Well, just remember, the insight in the verse didn't come from me; it came from Rabbi Hirsch.
Thanks for passing that on.
I don't want to take credit for something where credit isn't due. But certainly that message is something that really is inherent in our considering what the Torah is intended to do in the world. And at that level, I completely agree with you, 100%. Okay, so that's...
Excuse me, Sandy was going to say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, if I might. So I think I understand the explanation of orach, but derech, is it a general moving toward God himself, whereas the other one has more to do with social interaction among men, or not so?
Again, with respect to orach pertaining to social interaction, yes. I wouldn't say that derech is more moving toward God. Ultimately, orach also is means through which we resonate with God's will. Again, I'm specifically invoking the notion of Weltanschauung, that is an all-encompassing way. that's not merely in social interactions, but the gamut of all of the laws that the Torah comprises,
Okay.
that are all included in the derech, but not all of which are orach.
Got it.
So orach is a subset. It's not the whole thing that the derech on some level is.
Got it.
So again, of course, reflecting on the thrust of those opening 3 words in the Hebrew in Psalm 119, Ashrei Tmimei Darech. Fortunate, striving forward are those who are perfect on the way, that all-encompassing way that ultimately we appreciate as clarified by the couplet format, with respect to the second half of that verse, Haholchim b'Torat Adonai, who go in the Torah of the Lord. And of course, inevitably, to that extent, that's where we now direct our attention with respect to Torah. With respect to Torah and a whole set of pseudo-synonyms that we encounter in Psalm 119, and also in Psalm 19. And in this vein, I'll just note that I guess in anticipating Bob's proposition for our study today, Rabbi Hirsch, in his introduction to Psalm 119, actually specifies this very issue. This psalm declares that the understanding and fulfillment of the divine Torah is the supreme concern, one might say indeed the sole concern of a Jewish person. And again, the extent to which it will apply not only to Jewish people, we've already noted. This certainly is not cutting off anyone else from this discussion. This would embrace Jewish law with all of its components. And now he lists them. Torot, the teachings that instruct and ennoble the mind and spirit. Bob has already apprised me that everyone here is well acquainted with the poor translation of Torah as law, where really properly we should render it as teaching. Eidut, testimonials, and Rabbi Hirsch comments, the institutions ordained by God symbolic of these teachings. Pikudim, the mandates to be executed with regard to the creatures entrusted to our care. These are just an outline. Obviously, we're going to have to justify all of these. Mitzvot, the commandments which point out to us our station in this life. Chukim, the statutes which sanctify the central aspects of our lives by assigning them the proper bounds. By the way, parenthetically, I really have no clue what exactly in the English word statutes corresponds to chukim, but we're talking about chukim. Whether it's statutes or not is negotiable, but it certainly is chukim in the Hebrew. And mishpatim, the ordinances, I prefer judgements, even though the translations all say ordinances, for the simple reason that I have no clue what an ordinance is. So we'll say judgments, governing our relationships within society. The Jew, the sum total of all these laws constitute Devar Hashem, the word of God, the pronouncement of God, but he feels that this law is best defined by the term Imra. Imra, utterance, saying, for the verb Amar, in connection with God's law, denotes the concept of imparting explanation, expounding, and tradition. And hence is consistent with an endeavor directed not simply upon memorizing that which has been declared to be the law, but upon the full and thorough understanding of this law, of this properly Torah teaching. Now I realize that's a very brief outline, and you would be completely justified in saying it's a complete enigma as to how anything there corresponds to the terse descriptions given. And the truth of the matter is that in order to be able to have a better sense of what each of these terms connotes, we really do need to turn to Psalm 19 in order to inform our understanding of Psalm 119. I'll just note as a prelude to that, Rabbi Hirsch was a prolific author. Besides the commentary on the 5 books of Moses and the commentary on Psalms, probably the magnum opus of Rabbi Hirsch is Horeb. This is just volume 1 of the 2-volume set. As you can see, not for any slouch, which is an extraordinary compendium on the philosophy of all of the commandments, the Jewish laws and observances, the commandments of the Torah. And again, I'll just note for now that he divides the commandments into these categories with a pithy summation of what is included in these categories, that Torot, the plural of Torah, fundamental principles relating to mental and spiritual preparation for life. Eidot, testimonials, symbolic observances representing truths which form the basis of Israel's life. Mishpatim, declarations of justice toward human beings. Chukim, laws of righteousness toward those beings which are subordinate to man, toward earth, plant, animal, and toward one's own body, mind, spirit, and word. Mitzvot, commandments of love. The 6th and final division, avodah, divine service, which isn't exactly a synonym for a particular corpus of commandments, but it certainly is relevant in this context. Now, again, I state this merely by way of pithy introduction. When we launch into a discussion of what all of these terms connote, on some plane, I feel, just as a matter of historical integrity, that it is germane for us to note that the distinction between 2 of these terms is enunciated explicitly in our tradition, going back to really the first stratum of post-biblical literature, the Midrash, the Baraita, the distinction between chukim and mishpatim. And this distinction between the two is drawn in particular on what we read in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 4, you shall do my mishpatim. We'll leave that as judgments, or maybe we should just leave it untranslated. Mishpatim. And keep my chukim. So again, most translations will render that as statutes, whatever statutes means. To walk in them, I am the Lord your God. And similarly, in the verse that follows, you shall keep my chukim, my statutes, and my mishpatim, my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. So the comment that we find in our tradition regarding these 2 categories, granted, we aren't addressing the whole gamut of all of the categories that we have noted that appears in Psalm 119, But in comparing these two, we make the observation that the mishpatim are those matters that even had they not been recorded in the Torah and God's word, we would have appreciated that they needed to be imperatives. And the list of examples that are presented is, I think, noteworthy. And some of you may intuitively appreciate what the list of examples signifies, because they are all drawn from a fairly well-known corpus. At the risk of making this too obvious, I'll state a corpus to which it is possible that James is alluding in Acts chapter 15. The list is paganism, sexual immorality, bloodshed, theft, and blasphemy. Now, these are 5 examples, and they're all drawn from the Noahide laws. Now, the Noahide laws is a construct that we don't see explicitly in the Bible. We have a biblical tradition that associates them with the first command that God gives Adam in Genesis chapter 2. Be that as it may, again, the possibility that when there's the deliberation in Acts chapter 15 as to what will be demanded of the Gentiles, that the list that James gives is intended as a brief encapsulation of that list of imperatives. The Torah is what the Jews read every Sabbath in the synagogue. The Noahide covenant is that which is binding on all of humanity. What, of course, is the salient feature that pertains to these commandments? That on some level they are intuitive. Now, I say on some level they are intuitive. This is a crucial point for me to stress, because once, many years ago, I gave a series of talks on the Noahide laws at the Baptist House of the Free University of the Netherlands in Amsterdam, and I conflated the notion of the Noahide laws with a Kantian moral imperative. And that's wrong. So it's important for me to stress that I have definitely repented and recanted from the statement that I made then. It's wrong because, after all, understanding the concept of a Kantian moral imperative as that which, if abrogated by all the members of society, would lead to the undoing of that society, is a characterization that could, at best, only be applied to 2 of the Noahide prohibitions, the prohibition on theft and the prohibition on murder, certainly not the rest. The intuitive undergirding of the corpus of the Noahide laws is that we have built into ourselves an innate striving for holiness. And that holiness then will seek to find its expression in each of the 3 relationships that defines the essence of the human condition. Our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with our fellow man, and our relationship with God, with transcendent meaning in life. So as a reflection of infusing holiness into our relationship with our fellow man, there is a prohibition on murder, and not just murder, but also stealing. With respect to our relationship with God, there is a prohibition on paganism, on deifying what is not divine. And not only that, but also a prohibition on blasphemy, cursing God in God's name, which is also an absurdity, because after all, if you believe in God, you shouldn't be cursing him. And if you don't believe in God, you shouldn't be cursing in his name. So again, even if there's not an imperative in an affirmative manner to believe in God, the prohibitions on paganism and blasphemy. And with respect to self, the 2 drives that most animate human beings that we share with the animal kingdom, the drives of food and sex. if you will, preservation of the individual and preservation of the species, through each of which we could debase ourselves and make ourselves into animals. And infusing holiness into our relationship with self means the prescriptions on, in the case of sex, the illicit sexual relationships, and on the level of food, this is not on the list that we cited, but nonetheless, it is one of the Noachide laws, the prohibition on eating a limb torn from a living animal. Not really the vulgar debasement of cruelty with respect to the animal kingdom, but the implications with respect to my eating like an animal. So again, on both of these levels, the drive to food, the drive to sex, to imbue our lives with holiness. The seventh Noachide law is to establish a legal system for the enforcement of the other six. But again, in that vein, the mishpat, the judgment, is something that through our human judgment, we can appreciate as an imperative. And there is that aspect of the Torah. The Torah, if you will, as the social rational imperative with which we can relate intuitively. That's part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. And it's important for me to stress this point. There are many authors who attempt, by nook or by crook, of establishing some kind of conflation between the Torah and morality. And it doesn't work. Because while they are unequivocally overlapping sets, they aren't one set. And to that extent, then, we appreciate that there is the aspect of Torah that is a social and rational imperative that we can indeed conflate with our conception of morality. But simultaneously, there's also the chok. Now, again, chok gets typically translated as statute, but since I don't know what a statute is, I'll just talk about what a chok is. Chok, lachkok, the verb form in Hebrew, means to engrave. In other words, if you will, in a veritably literal sense, to have it written stone, something that is immovable and irrevocable. And this pertains not to that with which I intuitively resonate, but that to which I submit as that which God imposes upon me, even though I don't feel natural resonance with it. And indeed, in the passage in our tradition, post-biblical tradition, that distinguishes between the mishpat and the chok, the characterization of the former is what we would have known intuitively even had not been written. The characterization of the latter is that the Satan, the instigator, refutes them. We have this inner voice that says, don't do it, it doesn't make a difference. So the Satan refutes them. Likewise, in a parallel formulation, the Yetzer Hara, the drive toward evil in all of our hearts. That is, that urge to cast off any yoke of fidelity to a divinely imposed discipline. Likewise refutes them, says, what do you need this for? And the critical premise that the system of Torah, and maybe we should emphasize here once again, as opposed to a system of wisdom, of humanism, is going to contain within it both of these aspects, both the mishpat and the chok. And that's a critical bifurcation for us to appreciate, not so much because it's a bifurcation, but because, on the contrary, it's a synthesis. The Torah encompasses within it both of these. It's not one or the other. It is necessarily both. So that's a if you will, an ancestral distinction to be drawn, because as I say, it comes from a very early stratum of our literature. But now, considering the 3 verses that invoke 6 different dimensions of what we get from God in Psalm 19, and the implications, of course, inevitably, with respect to Psalm 119, where we find these terms. First, the Torah of God is tmima. We could render that as perfect or all-encompassing. It responds to or restores the soul. Second, the edut, the testimony of God, is faithful, making wise the fool or the inexperienced. Third, there are 2 perverse, of course. The pikudim, the mandates of the Lord, are upright, rejoicing the heart. Fourth, the mitzvah, the commandment of God, is brilliant, enlightening the eyes. Fifth, this is a little bit of the odd man out, as it were, unless we understand the implications of the fear of the Lord as also pertaining to a component of the commandments, which indeed Rabbi Hirsch proposes, that the fear or reverence of God is pure, enduring forever. And sixth, the mishpatim, judgements, ordinances, mishpatim. The mishpatim of God are truth. They are universally just. So, to share with you, at least in brief, Rabbi Hirsch's insights with respect to these, the Torah of the Lord gives man a divine teaching, which encompasses every aspect of his existence. This doctrine implants in his heart and spirit the seeds of the knowledge of what is good and true, and the ability to perceive such qualities for the physical, mental, earthly, and heavenly facets of his life. Now, the planting of seeds is a salient observation here. He notes the word Torah is derived from the root letters hara, hey, resh, hey, which of course is also the root of parents and of pregnancy, the planting of the seed within. To implant within someone a seed which is in the process of steady growth. So this Torah of God, who leads mankind to its goal, tells him in an all-encompassing, in a perfect manner, the significance of his entire physical and spiritual being, with its physical dependence and moral freedom of the will in the kingdom of God, for the divine kingdom of the Torah, which shapes and rules the world. And therefore, the Torah is described as responding to or restoring the soul. As he takes it, the implication is it leads him out of all doubt that torments his soul. Because what torments the soul is the feeling that we're just here aimlessly. And subordinate everything to this all-encompassing divine plan is the ultimate restoration of the soul. And that then is the starting point. That's the first term that appears in this sequence of 6 in Psalm 19. Again, beginning in, well, I reckon it's going to be verse 8. And the second component in that verse, the edut, the testimonial. The Torah does not content itself, however, with merely expressing its truths in didactic words for the guidance of the mind and heart. It has devised acts, significant symbols and actions to express its most important truths. These signs, called edim, edot, which is likewise the word for witness, are to be testimonials of God's world, reminding, warning, and admonishing us as they accompany us through life. at crucial moments when we are susceptible to the pitui, which is indeed of the same etymology as the petty, the fool, the seduction, the whispers of temptation, or when we have already fallen prey to them, these testimonials serve to bring to our minds those divine truths in which is contained all the wisdom of life. And to that extent, they are faithful. They are faithful to us. They will never desert us. And he cites a corpus of commandments that are explicitly invoked as testimonials, if you will, as signs. And inevitably, in this vein, I feel it is apt to note first in the Hebrew of Scripture, we of course encounter in both masculine forms and feminine forms ed and edah, meaning witness. That is, we first encounter the feminine form edah as the sheep that are set apart as witness, says Abraham, that I dug this well. Likewise, actually, in the Torah portion that we just read this past Shabbat, the heap of testimony is an edah, a witness not for the past, but for the future, that neither of us will cross this border in order to harm the other. And the same word edah, meaning witness in the feminine gender, also has an additional meaning in biblical Hebrew, assembly. We encounter reference to the princes of the assembly in Exodus chapter 16, verse 22, and chapter 34, verse 31. Without belaboring this point to excess, I will merely note an additional instance of assembly that in a purely parochial context is of significance legally in Jewish tradition. And that is the reference to the evil assembly of the spies who badmouthed the land of Israel. The spies who did so being so described in Numbers chapter 14, verses 27 and 35. And of what particular significance is this evil assembly? Well, this is going to sound, I warn you, very Jewish. There's a number associated here. Because there were 12 spies, 2 of them were righteous, Joshua and Caleb, which means there were 10 members of this evil assembly, which teaches us that an assembly is at minimum 10 people. And as undoubtedly you can already discern at this point, that becomes a derivation from Scripture of the notion of there being a quorum, an edah, an assembly, for certain prayers that require a quorum present. And why am I emphasizing this point? I'm emphasizing this point because of a dimension that I think is critical in our appreciating the import of testimonial. I feel a need to toss another word into this stew, and that is the Hebrew word od. Now, od just means more. Of what significance is it here? Because a witness always signifies a more. A witness, after all, comes into court in order to solve what would otherwise be an insurmountable epistemological problem. We want to know what happened in a particular event of which the judges have no direct knowledge. So the witness comes into court, and by the witness coming into court, in essence, the event to which the witness is testifying is dragged into the court as well. And through the testimony, the judges now behold, experience the event to which the witnesses are testifying. So the witness is always more than just the witness. The assembly is always more than merely the individuals whom the assembly comprises. Because when you have that minimum quorum, then inevitably, what do we also have? Well, the salient message here is what is emergent in Psalm 82, where we read, God stands in the assembly of God. And what's the assembly? That on some level, when there is this minimum quorum that comes together in prayer, then God's presence is there as well. It's also a more. And with respect to this component of the Torah that is called Eidot, testimonials, there is the more. The more meaning the significance of the symbolic act. The symbolic act necessarily always invokes more than merely itself. And we should just note in this regard that this inevitably will pertain not just to a component of the Torah, but to the significance and centrality of symbolic acts generally. I'll just cite two from the prophets as brief illustrations of this idea. I realize we don't have an infinite amount of time, but I think it's an important point for us to appreciate that, well, perhaps one of the most striking, jarring instances of a symbolic act that we encounter in the prophets is that which we read in Isaiah in chapter 20, verse 3, that as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years. As you can well imagine, there is a broad-ranging debate as to whether this should be understood literally or not. But that's what the text reads. That as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a portent upon Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the prisoners of Egypt and the exiles of Ethiopia, young and old, naked and barefoot. A symbolic act, a sign. On a somewhat similar plane, although certainly not nearly as jarring as that example, the end of the prophecy of Jeremiah, before we get to chapter 52, which is really not part of the prophecy of Jeremiah per se, it's more or less a copy of the last chapter of the book of Kings. In Jeremiah, in chapter 51, at the end of the chapter, Jeremiah commands Suriah, the son of Neriah, to take the book of all of the evil that is to come upon Babylon. And he commands Suriah, when you come to Babylon and shall see and shall read all these words, then you shall say, O Lord, you have spoken against this place to cut it off, that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. And it shall be, when you have made an end of reading this book, that you shall bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. And you shall say, thus shall Babylon sink and shall not rise, because of the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Symbolic act. The book is tossed into the Euphrates. Thus shall Babylon sink. So the significance of the symbolic act, because it's more. It's the act, It's an actual act. Again, whether we understand the passage in Isaiah literally or not, it's an actual act. And it invokes more than itself. All the commandments that are described as signs that invoke something like the Exodus, like creation, the cycle of the festivals, the sanctity of the Sabbath, these are testimonials. And that's, again, the second category, because the system that is in the broadest of terms to encompass every aspect of existence needs to be concretized, first and foremost, in terms of the testimonials. The third component, the pikudim, the mandates of the Lord are upright, rejoicing the heart. And Rabbi Hirsch, almost inevitably, notes that the root letters of pikudim, pei, kuf, daled, we encounter in a very different context. In, for example, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 23, where we encounter the construction pikadon as a trust, that which is entrusted in an individual who is its guardian, watching over it. And so it is in this vein that he proposes that the pikudim are mandates to be understood from the point of view of the objects to which they refer. Their objects are pikadon, entrusted to us, possessions entrusted to us by the Lord who created both them and mankind. We stand pikudim as entrusted under the orders and obligations given us with regard to them by the Lord, who has installed man in his terrestrial world to keep and preserve these goods in the spirit of the purpose for which they were created. We too are an integral part of this world with all the forces and faculties with which we are endowed, and we are as responsible for their proper use and preservation as we are for that of the other treasures given us by God. And that's the subject of the pikudim. And of course, to that extent, therefore, they rejoice the heart. They give us that joy of life with which nothing can ever dim, that satisfaction which comes from a task well done. There can be no substitute for this feeling of quiet joy and serenity that is secure in the knowledge that we have done what was expected of us in life. We have kept the trust that was entrusted to us. That is the third component, the pikudim. And then the fourth, mitzvah, the commandment of the Lord, is clear, is brilliant, enlightening the eyes. All these tasks are indeed upright. It is true that they are in accordance with our own nature as well as with that of all the creatures concerning which these mandates were enjoined upon us. However, had they not been the commandment of God, God commanded us as our duty by the Lord himself, we would never have been able to arrive at them ourselves by means of our own sophistry and speculation. Certainly, we could never have devised them ourselves in as broad and specific a form as that in which they were handed down to us by the Lord's command. And of course, this again is the critical difference between the wisdom and the Torah. That is, you can talk about being entrusted, and on some level, you can talk about that in ethical humanism as well. And critically, the second half of this second verse, the fourth component, is particularly enunciating the divine status of the divine command, by reason of which the commandment of the Lord is of cloudless clarity, which remains bright forever. It shows us at all times where our duty lies. It is that which is enlightening of the eyes. It opens our eyes to the proper recognition of our tasks and helps us fulfill our duties to both men and things simply because they are indeed our duties as given us by God. It's not merely some kind of mundane stewardship, which is maybe good enough, certainly compared with people who abuse the world around them, but it's a stewardship that is divinely vested, and that's critical. Now, when we consider the fifth component in the verse in Psalm 19 is fear of the Lord, which seems incongruous here, because prima facie, it's not a component of the commandments. And predictably, what Rabbi Hirsch proposes is that this sentence, just like those preceding and those following, also refers to a certain definite aspect of this duty as set down in divine law. We may safely assume that the laws referred to in this part of the verse belong in the category of chukim. Again, apropos of the essential division that we already noted in the first stratum of post-biblical literature. And we can propose here that the chukim, again, that which is written in stone, are specifically described as fear of the Lord because most essentially, it's the code of discipline. The code of discipline, not because you understand it, not because it resonates with what you would have intuitively expected, but because you need to have that sense of a code of discipline that is imposed by God. And that's an essential. And to that extent, then, he indeed reflects upon the two groups of laws, the chukim and the mishpatim. Again, chukim, statutes, however way you choose to describe them, that which is engraved, and the judgements, otherwise known as ordinances, but mishpatim, and the critical realization that these two, as the fifth and sixth components here, are critical in molding us as servants of God. It's important for there to be that aspect that indeed resonates with us intuitively, but it is no less critical for there to be that aspect that indeed eludes our definitive understanding. Not incidentally, one of the greatest of the medieval Jewish philosophers, Rabbi Judah Halevi, in his philosophical magnum opus, the Kuzari, recasts what ostensibly is this very bifurcation of chukim and mishpatim in terms of the social and rational imperatives versus what he describes as the divine deeds. And the critical dimension here is not, if you will, incomprehensibility or lack of intuitive resonance. The critical dimension is with what aspect of your inner identity, what makes you tick, do these commandments interact? That is, every human being is endowed with an intellect. That which is a social or rational imperative communicates with the intellect, resonates with the intellect. But there's also a divine soul. The divine deeds don't merely pertain to man as Homo sapiens, because Homo sapiens implies that all that man has is an intellect that distinguishes man from animal. Well, the intellect does indeed signify a crucial distinction between the human and the animal. We don't posit that it's merely a quantitative distinction, but a qualitative one. But there's a more essential qualitative distinction, and that is the soul. That while, as we read in the description of creation, God summons the earth to bring forth the animal kingdom, and to that extent, indeed, all animals are described as nefesh chaya, living beings. When we read of the creation of man, first in Genesis chapter 1, there is a curious employment of the plural. In summoning forth animal life, In chapter 1, verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind. In verse 26, God said, let us make mankind with our essence. So why the plural? There are a number of interpretations. I'd like to share with you the interpretation of the great medieval commentator, Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, who proposes, well, in verse 24, God addresses the earth to bring forth animal life. In verse 26, he says, as it were, to the earth, you produce the physical being. I endow that being with the immortal godly soul. So it's going to be a joint effort. The animal is just physical. The human is endowed with spirit. And of course, as we read in chapter 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. Again, the physical comes from the earth and breathed into him the living soul. That living soul is not merely the physical. And so when we consider the implications of the mishpat and the chok, certainly explicit in Psalm 119, admittedly implicit in Psalm 19, because we just read about fear of God in the formulation in chapter 19, in my reckoning, it's going to be verse 10. But there are those two aspects that need to be coherent with one another, because the one without the other is perforce necessarily limiting. Now, there's an additional nuance that we also need to note, in particular in Psalm 119, because again, we're not encountering chok per se in Psalm 19, and that is, curiously, with respect to all of these pseudo-synonyms, uniquely chok appears in both genders. There is chok, which grammatically, since all nouns in Hebrew are of masculine or feminine genders, is the masculine gender. There's also chukah. Chukah is in the feminine gender. And why specifically is this one word subject to this gender ambiguity? It's not the only case in which we find a gender ambiguity. For example, all Hebrew experts are undoubtedly familiar with tzedek, which is in the masculine gender and means justice, and tzedakah in the feminine gender, which is imperfectly translated as charity. Now, it's a bad translation because I give a charity because I'm being charitable, and I give it tzedakah because justice dictates that I support those who are in need. So tzedakah specifically comes from the root of tzedek, meaning justice. And yet, there's a difference between the masculine gender and the feminine gender, isn't there? That is, what we could state is the masculine gender is maybe more uncompromising and non-integrative. And the feminine gender implies a more integrative, holistic view. So the harsh tzedek, meaning justice, morphs into feminine gender tzedakah, which is based upon justice, helping those who are in need. And perhaps in the same vein, chok has a kind of harshness to it. As I stated at the outset, engraved in stone, uncompromising, absolute. And undoubtedly, that is on some level the undergirding precisely of the chok, going back to the earliest bifurcation that we noted, which is that the chok is that with which our drive toward evil descends and the instigator refutes, and so on and so forth. So the chok is uncompromising. There's a code of discipline. And we could almost say in the harshest of terms, submit. And that's true. But chok also needs to morph into chukah. Because there is that aspect of submit, but maybe we should speak not only of submit, but resonate. Submit has a harshness to it that is true, but is inadequate. So of all of these pseudo-synonyms, the one that needs the additional nuance of being cast in both masculine and feminine forms is specifically the chok, that needs also to be resolved into the chukah. And to that extent, that certainly is this additional stratum of considering this framework of words for Torah. I still want to talk about Amar and Diber, but maybe we should pause now. I realize our time is also limited, but if anyone has anything to comment with respect to what we've just discussed.
Would you show or repeat that book on that Rabbi Hirsch?
Rabbi Hirsch's commentary on the Psalms. Oh,
the
the additional book that I cited, Horeb.
Horeb. H-O-R.
Yeah, here it is.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Can we continue with Amar? I realize our time is limited, but I'd like to at least be able to reach this threshold. Can we?
Yes. So just to sort of chart our course, we've you first took us through paths and ways, and I'm using the English just for brevity. And we talked about the different words that were in Psalm 119, but
both Psalm 19 and 119.
And so you took us back to 119, and we've walked through the six elements of Psalm 19. But the two that were remaining, if I understand right, are because there were 6 different elements for Torah overall from Rabbi Hirsch, was it? And so you're going to take us through those last 2. Is that am I?
That is Amar and Diber, the words that mean say or speak. That is the 6 that we discussed aren't specifically from him; they're from Psalm 19. But again, his critical additional insight, which I think is almost an inevitable one, is to conflate fear of God with one of these components of the commandments, and then to associate it with the chukim. And then we have these 6 pseudo-synonyms that we indeed encounter repeatedly in Psalm 119, namely Torah, Eidah, Mishpat and Chok, Mitzvah and Pikud, the 6 divisions that we've been discussing again in this last unit. But we have to consider again these other 2 words, which are different. That is, Amar or Imra and Diber are not pseudo-synonyms for the Torah. They are pseudo-synonyms for speech. And what distinguishes between them? So for that, I'm going to first make a general observation, in particular with respect to Diber, noting in particular, generally speaking, Diber is translated as speak, as in a term that is repeated over and over again in the Torah. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe. God spoke to Moses. And the most obvious observation with respect to Diber, the root letters, are of course identical with Davar. Davar meaning thing. So what's the connection? And on the most rudimentary plane, what I'm going to state is, when you speak, you transform an ethereal abstraction into a thing. You concretize it through speaking it. Remember back in elementary school when you had a vocabulary test and the teacher would ask you to define a given word, and You said, no, I know what it means. I just can't say it. And you got a 0. But you really did know. But you still got a 0. Because even if you really knew, if you couldn't concretize it in speech, it doesn't matter. It doesn't help. It remained that ethereal abstraction, and the whole exercise was precisely to transform the ethereal abstraction into something concrete that was necessary, that was crucial. And that is the dibur, the speech, that takes the abstraction and makes it into a davar. So that's certainly on the most elementary plane is critical in our understanding what speech is. Now, in particular, in the distinction between amar and diber, I'd like to share with you first the insight of Rabbi Meir Leibush Malbim, whom we mentioned at the outset, but we haven't really had a chance to discuss because of time limitations. He makes the following proposition. This is in a slim volume that he composed precisely on pseudo-synonyms in the Bible, precisely to differentiate between their nuances. And what he proposes here is that amar, which usually is translated into English as say, is a speech that is terse and complete in a pithy number of words, whereas dibur, speech, pertains to something that is more elaborated, more expansive, more clarified. And that distinction, in a way, I think also helps us to understand the distinction drawn by his contemporary. They certainly weren't commenting on one another because they were writing almost at exactly the same time, but the comment of Rabbi Hirsch in his commentary on Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, the verse is relatively accessory with respect to the comment. The comment is more expansive with respect to the whole story of creation. Diber and amar. There is a fine distinction between the use of these two words. Diber, so he associates phonetically with dor, generation, the row of contemporary people, and various other similar cognate words. I'm still going to reiterate my proposition that diber is related to taking an abstraction and making it into a thing. But he states, this means the simple joining of syllables to form words and words to sentences, thereby to express thoughts in words without consideration of their entering the ears or affecting the minds of a hearer. Simply speaking. Again, taking the ethereal abstraction and making it into a thing in the most rudimentary and direct sense of transforming an abstraction into something concrete. One can speak in the sense of diber without a listener. But amar is to say something to somebody, to convey something to him, related to omer, the sheaf, chomer, the heap. It connects the words actually spoken with their meaning and purpose, and wants, by means of speech, to bring the concentrated thoughts and undivided will of the speaker to an equal concentration in the mind of the hearer. Hence, amar always has the intention of having an immediate result, because you're saying something to an object, a recipient. Not so diber, because there isn't any presumption of a listener altogether. Hence, we speak of, and these are two formulations, one of which is indeed explicitly biblical, the other is a biblical derivative Asara Ma'amarot and Aseret HaDibrot. To clarify, in perhaps the earliest stratum of post-biblical literature, in the Mishnah, in Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5, we read through 10 ma'amarot from Amar, utterances, sayings, the world was created. Well, just count them up. In Genesis chapter 1, 10 times we encounter Vayomer. So this 10 sayings of creation. And then there is the Decalogue. In the parlance of the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, Aseret HaDevarim. Curiously, in post-biblical literature, it is Aseret HaDibrot. I'm not really sure why there's the change from Davar to Dibra, but they of course come from the same root. The Decalogue is described in terms of Dibur. And on the most elementary plane, we appreciate, in light of what Rabbi Hirsch says, which on some level I think is a resonance of the idea expressed by the Malbim, that the 10 sayings of creation call forth the earth. Very immediately. Vayomer, God said, let there be light. And there was light. Now, of course, it goes without saying that we cannot possibly understand this in terms of any literal saying or speech, because that would inevitably lead to the conundrum that if saying has some kind of recipient, well, if there's a recipient for let there be light, that means light already exists. And if there's no recipient, then to whom is God saying it? So obviously we understand this on an anthropomorphic plane, not in the sense of anything that is literal as we use the terms in human affairs, but still saying as that which immediately calls forth that which is described in terms of the saying. And what about the Decalogue? What about the Dibrot? The Dibrot are still on an ongoing level, the divine speech that never abates. The sayings of creation, they're a one-time phenomenon. They don't continue to resonate in the world because the object for which they were uttered, so to speak, was immediately achieved. God said, let there be light. There was light. Finished. But the Decalogue, the 10 speeches, or alternatively, certainly in the expression that we encounter in Deuteronomy, the 10 things, abstractions, corporealized, concretized, in imperatives with which we constantly interact, with which we need continuously to interact. It's never finished. It's always something ongoing. It's something that demands of us constantly hearkening to the call. We have this tradition that there's a divine echo that constantly reverberates in the world from Sinai. It's not finished yet. That's the Dibur. And I think it's important, of course, to appreciate that, indeed, with respect to the Torah, which is it? Of course, inevitably, it's both. And the whole gamut of everything we said until now continues to apply. With respect to Amar and Diber, and this is maybe a little bit of a culmination, a coming together of everything we discussed today, the aspect of Imra, the divine saying, means something that isn't merely a speech, but something said to us directly. Dibur, again, carries this connotation of something that is set into the ether and it continues to reverberate in the world. Well, it's true, but there's also the saying. God is saying this to us right now, immediately, directly. And it needs to demand of us a palpable result in terms of our resonating with this divine saying, here, now, immediately. Transformative. On the one hand. On the other hand, always on the one hand, the other hand. On the other hand, the divine speech. A speech that does not have a specific particularized address, but rather on an ongoing basis in every generation, in all of human history, through the present to the uncharted future, is a speech that is constantly concretizing, corporealizing the abstract truths of God revealed to the world in the Torah. And it's an ongoing challenge for each and every one of us. Yes, there is this aspect of the saying that speaks directly to us, that elicits from us an immediate response. And it's critical for us to appreciate that, because otherwise we are in grave danger of abstracting Torah and precisely thereby negating exactly what the process of davar, dibur, is. Taking abstractions and concretizing them. It's important for us to appreciate there is indeed that direct, immediate address of the Torah to ourselves. But simultaneously, there is that far, far more expansive principle of the dibur being revealed in the world. And it's constantly being revealed, continuously being revealed. And so it needs to be in every generation anew, every day anew. Not just every person, but every person every day anew. To distill from this ongoing dibur that is reverberating in the world, how the world itself is being molded by the divine speech that transforms it. If we don't get to that, then we haven't reached the culmination. If we don't have the amar, we haven't gotten started. If we don't have the dibur, we've just gotten started. We need them both. So I hope this gives us some rudimentary introduction to Psalm 119, certainly not intended as anything more than an introduction, but I hope at least something of an initial introduction to that process of receiving God's Torah, which is what Psalm 119, it's all about instruction, acrostic, is instructing us to be able to do. Can we open this up?
Thank you so much, Rabbi. And I'd like the others to have a chance to comment or question. I just have one connection from what you said about the word dibur. In Psalm 119:16, it ends with that word saying, I shall delight in your statutes, I shall not forget your word. And that word there is dibur. So I find it amazing that if it is God's speech that is expansive, is that word, that there's a high honor, a calling, where David here is saying he doesn't want to forget any of it. I wonder how you connect to that.
I mean, I think that's indeed a corollary of what we discussed. That is, the davar being a concretization of divine truths that are revealed in the world, inevitably is so precious because it is through every one of those, again, words or things, because davar can be translated either way. Validly, it means both. It is through every single one that we are connecting with those divine truths. And again, that it doesn't merely remain an abstraction. It becomes something concretized in our lives. That's critical.
Thank you so much. Anybody else?
This concept of the echo from Mount Sinai, I love this concept. And it's from the Sephar, right?
Sorry?
The Sepharia, the Sephar? Where is it from?
It comes, it is enunciated in the corpus of Baraita. That means really the first stratum of post-biblical literature, the material that ultimately was redacted into the Mishnah, the material that was left outside. So from this vast corpus of statements, a sixth chapter of Ethics of the Fathers was fabricated. In as much as the Mishnah of Ethics of the Fathers is 5 chapters long, but the custom arose just to go through the background to study Ethics of the Fathers on the Sabbaths between Passover and Pentecost. There are 6 Sabbaths. So in order to have the material for the 6th Sabbath, distilling from the Baraita was what was indeed titled the chapter of acquisition of Torah. The second statement in that chapter begins with the words, "On every day a divine echo goes forth from Sinai."
Interesting. In Pirkei Avot.
So it's, again, it's the 6th chapter, which is like the 6th of 5 chapters. So it's important for us to understand that's why I say it is formally Baraita as opposed to Mishnah, but it comes from the same stratum historically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to look that up. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, Rabbi Chaim Eisen, we are so grateful for your taking the time to teach us today. We were interested in the Hebrew meanings of the words of Psalm 119. It's a difficult psalm. We've struggled through it for years, and the time that you've invested in helping us understand the Jewish view of it with some thoughts of your own as well has been a real blessing. So we just want to say thank you so much, Rabbi Chaim Eisen, and may you be blessed in all of your work in the days ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. God bless you. God bless you all.